The war that Yahya Sinwar launched on October 7th, 2023 was meant to profoundly restructure the Middle East. And that's happening, although not in the way the late Hamas leader envisioned. It's not easy to discern the emerging new realities, to understand the rivalries among the many jihadi groups and leaders, Sunni and Shia, the shifting threats to Israelis, Kurds, Druze, Christians, and those Arabs who are not eager to sacrifice their children to the cause of Islamic supremacy. David Wurmser is attempting to comprehend and explain these realignments and to suggest responses that would further American interests. David holds a doctorate from Johns Hopkins, where he studied the history and ideology of the Ba'ath Party that once ruled both Iraq and Syria. He was a senior advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney and to National Security Advisor John Bolton. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Security, the Miskov Institute for Zionist Strategy, and the Jerusalem Center for Foreign and Security Affairs. He recently wrote an essay for a small but serious journal called The Editors, which was founded by Ira Stoll, a fine journalist who's been with us here on Foreign Policy. The title of David's essay, Prepare for Disintegration of Syria and Rise of Imperial Turkey. I'm eager to talk with him about the sandstorms he sees gathering. I'm Cliff May, and I'm glad you're with us, too, here on Foreign Policy. Welcome, David. You're a sight for sore eyes. It's been much too long.
Indeed it has, yeah.
Look, before you discuss the big picture, a little that's in the news, I caught a post you had on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it nowadays, in response to President Trump's suggestion or proposal, I'm not sure what it was, you never know, to relocate Gaza residents to Jordan, or Egypt, or other Muslim countries to what he called an area where they can live without disruption and revolution and violence, and to allow reconstruction of Gaza to get underway. You wrote, for 30 years, Washington policy elites pushed a two-state land for peace paradigm that failed repeatedly with thousands dead each time. October 7th, only the last round. It's time to think out of the box. The president's idea has a lot of merit and historical substance to it. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, sure. I mean, ever since Oslo, really even almost before Oslo, but ever since Oslo, the two-state solution, namely establishing a Palestinian state in Gaza and in the West Bank, has been what has governed Washington policy establishment imagination. And it's been tried. The Israelis have tried to go as far as they can go on this. They withdrew from Gaza pretty much entirely in several phases, but by 2005, there were zero Israelis in Gaza. Gaza had essentially was already an independent state. It had all the trappings of a state. It had its own foreign policy. It had its own army, its own police, its own structure of government, its own budget. It was completely detached from Israel. And it had at first fully open access to the world, controlled its own borders. It had full access to the rest of the world through Israel and through Egypt. But through terrorism, over time, the Israeli border had to become much more controlled, although things were still coming in and out, and people were coming in and out all the way up until October 7th. Tens of thousands of Gazans were still working in Israel. The Egyptian border is really an issue between Egypt and Gaza, but in the last decade and a half, that border has increasingly been constricted, largely because the Egyptians fear the influence of the Hamas from Gaza and the Muslim Brotherhood and its relationship with Turkey, not just Iran, and the destabilization it posed to Egypt. So they were much more constrictive on the border. But otherwise, you had a fully independent Palestinian state that still had access to the world and was pretty much getting anything it needed for functioning as a country inside. Some weapons and dual-use equipment was restricted, but really nothing else.
And not successfully, because we had weapons pouring over and through 200 tunnels under the border with Egypt, which I don't think the Israelis understood, which they should have through intelligence, just how many holes in the ground, how many tunnels, and how much, and the amount of munitions coming through there. I just want to point that out. And by the way, that border with Egypt was never entirely closed. Hamas leaders and others were going out to Lebanon to train, going out to Iran to train. If you were just an average Joe, a cobbler, you might not be able to get out, but you probably didn't have enough money to do so. But if you were in the elites, you could come in and out through Egypt.
Oh, yeah. And about 15 years ago, they burst open the border, and it was clear that they brought a lot of people out and then sent them to Mashhad to train the Morabi to enforce under Jabari. And then they were re-infiltrated, and that was the forces that Israel had to fight largely in 2014 and 2012. So, yes, you've had this over and over again. But the bottom line is the Israelis in Gaza essentially created an independent state. In the West Bank, they tried to give up between 96 and 98% of the territory to be compensated by pieces in Israel for a Palestinian state. And there's essentially a functioning independent Palestinian government in Area B. All the time, these agreements were rejected, even though the Israelis offered them. So Israelis have desperately tried to create a two-state solution, and it has consistently failed. And it has consistently failed in an orgy of violence, whether it's the stunning violence in 2002 that claimed over 1,000 Israelis and an equal or greater number of Palestinians, whether it was now on October 7th, consistently throughout, you have seen the Palestinian answer by either the PLO and Mahmoud Abbas and Yasser Arafat, or by Hamas, the big no being answered by an orgy of blood.
Yeah, because
keep trying that.
Yeah, right. All right, and I want to get more. I want to talk more about this, but let me just also make these points that I think too many people don't recognize. One is that yes, Gaza was essentially a state, a proto-state. It had a government. It had large amounts of money pouring in from the so-called international donor community. It had the UN, various agencies taking care of social services. Hamas was not interested in building a state. It was interested. It said, as long as the money comes in, as long as the education is Muslim Brotherhood approved, we're going to do what we want to do. Our goal is to destroy Israel, nothing else. There's no others. There's nothing else that we want but to destroy Israel. And by the way, it wasn't an open-air prison. It wasn't a terrible place. It wasn't terribly poor compared to most Middle East cities or countries. Gaza did not do badly. There were, I mean, we know from the mayor of Gaza City and others and pictures that are coming out now that didn't come out then because the press was restricted. There were a lot of Gaza was a fairly nice place to be and could have been even more so, obviously. Now it's been, I think, largely rubbled by Israel because of what Hamas did. I don't think that's going to mean that anybody in Gaza loves Israel. I would hope that some would recognize this is what Hamas brought to us. They've destroyed our lives. It'll be generations, if at all. And that raises the question we get back to of what Trump is saying. Do you move them out? What, we were talking early in this conflict. What's the day after? The day after what? Hamas still has guns and weapons. They may not be as effective against the Israelis now that they don't have an army, but they're effective against other Gazans. Get on a soapbox and say, Hamas did this to us, and you will not wake up the next morning.
Yes, absolutely. We're now sort of at a watershed because we're in this ceasefire agreement.
Yeah.
Which has left Hamas in power.
Yeah.
And that was one of the core objectives of the war, because remember, Israel had two additional objectives other than returning the hostages. One was that Hamas's power and governance over Gaza is removed. And the second thing is that Gaza will never become another platform to attack the heart of Israel. And what you have here is those two objectives are not achieved and reversed, actually, by the agreement. So you really have a problem, though. So what are you going to do about that? Because those objectives are arguably as important as, or even more important than any of the others. So you have either the Israelis re-enter with force, occupy, militarily occupy, and spend years cleaning it out of any remnant of Hamas and essentially starting over. Or alternative, and I think this is where the president's idea came from, is you remove people from Gaza without restarting the war necessarily, but you remove people from Gaza. And then he made the case that this is not a permanent transfer, it's temporary. Now, how many will want to come back is anyone's guess, but my bet is most will not want to come back. But those that do, the Israelis can filter and remove any Hamas elements trying to re-infiltrate. So essentially, you move a population out, and then in the process of moving them back in, you filter out Hamas. And that way you get a population purged of its Hamas elements. How practical the return is a big question. But certainly the opening of the border, essentially opening this the Palestinians to be allowed to leave if they want, that's a very big taboo that's been crossed. And I think it opens up lots of possibilities for how this can resolve itself in the long run.
Clearly, the Egyptians, by which I mean particularly President Sisi, and the Jordanians, particularly I mean the king, they don't like this idea. And I assume the reason they don't like this idea is they figure this means that you're going to import more Muslim Brotherhood members into our country, and that's going to be a risk to our security. I mean, they're almost as afraid of them as the Israelis are. Is that your reading too? That's why they don't want it, or they just want the Palestinians to be what they have been, sacrificial pawns in the war against Israel, even though Egypt and Jordan are theoretically at peace with Israel.
Well, I think all Arab countries need to engage in a little bit of self-reflection that we're talking about 75 years of using the Palestinian issue to delegitimize Israel. So they bear considerable culpability about the problem's intractability right now. And they need to rethink their policies, and they need to act to some extent, in my view, with a degree of sheepishness rather than demanding too much, given their complicity in having created this problem to begin with. That said, I do very much understand what Jordan's government fears and what Egypt's government fears. But the proper answer would be to facilitate the transportation of these populations to places that maybe would want to accept them, at least temporarily, places like Turkey or so forth, that might be more amenable to having them come in. So nobody's asking them necessarily to take them permanently. We're asking them to take them temporarily or provide a transit corridor for them to other places. Things can be worked out practically, but the truth is, again, they're not offering any other options. The only other option people keep offering from the Arab world is we'll give them a state. But we saw what happened on October 7th, and one can only imagine what would have happened if the West Bank were as much of a state as Gaza were in all its territory. It's quite likely Israel would not have survived the war.
Right. You mentioned Turkey, and that's important in your essay. And the headline from today, we're recording this on Thursday, Turkish President Erdogan received a Hamas delegation at his palace. Now, Sisi of Egypt and the King of Jordan may fear the Muslim Brotherhood. Erdogan doesn't, because he is Muslim Brotherhood. Am I wrong in that?
Absolutely the opposite. He actually wants Sunni Muslim Brotherhood type people in his country because he has problems with the more European-oriented elements of his population, as well as the Kurds. Which are not a minor factor in Turkey. They're almost 40% of the population. So he is looking to, and he's doing the same, by the way, with Central Asian Islamists and Muslim Brotherhood forces, importing them from Uyghurs and everywhere else. So it's consistent with his policy of becoming the clearinghouse for international Muslim Brotherhood activity.
maybe let's go to your essay now, which everybody should read in its entirety. But I want you to give people a big, and it's because it's granular. It's in the editors. It's again a good journal, not a best known journal. So I want to give it a shout out here. But talk about the thesis that you really developed very in a very smart and intricate and provocative way.
Well, I think a lot of the problems in Syria originate in the idea of the Sykes-Picot, or the creation of the state systems in the Middle East, which are all problematic. And for the sake of stability, we've all sort of closed our eyes and tried to maintain that state system.
And I just want to make sure everyone knows we're talking about Sykes-Picot. We're talking about the French and the British after the fall of the Ottoman Empire saying, oh, okay, what we'll do here, we live in states in Europe. They should live in states here. In fact, there weren't states. There were empires. There were tribes. They had never really had states. Actually, if you want to look at a state in the Middle East early on, it would be Israel in its earlier incarnations, because it wasn't an empire. It was sort of a proto-nation state in ancient times. You may disagree. You're more of a scholar than I am, but I think I'm pretty right on that. So they say, we'll create an Iraq. We'll create a Syria. We'll create a Lebanon. We'll create Jordan. Out of what? Out of Eastern Palestine, about 2/3 of it, I would probably estimate. And we'll bring in a royal from Arabia because the Saudis don't want him there. So we'll import the Hashemite dynasty from there. Anyhow, I'm making it a little easier for people who may not, I don't want people to get lost.
No, but it was quite accurate what you said. And I think it's an important background. And what's happened is that in our sort of modernity, we keep thinking that the Middle East's problem is it's too primitive, it's too tribal. So if you create these states and then you invest those states with very strong centralized governments and institutions, they create a national identity and they can then move into modernity. When we're actually looking at the situation, those institutions and those urbanized populations and the breaking down of traditional structures have been the source of greatest radicalism in the region. And the centralization of power is also problematic because these are very unique communities that make up some of these states. If you're looking at Saudi Arabia, they're all Sunni Arabs, basically, and they're tribal, and there's a lot of fissures there, but still. But if you're looking at Syria, you are talking about a country that is only 40% Sunni Arab. And if any one faction, sect, controls the country, and it's heavily centralized and authoritarian, and even to some extent quasi-totalitarian in the attempt to erase older identities, then it becomes a matter of survival for the smaller communities to resist that. And the state, so the prescription of we need to keep a unified Syria is the prescription for either a slaughter of all those communities or perpetual civil war. It would be much better to have an either decentralized state or even smaller states, rather than this idea that we operate under, that we need to have this very aggressive centralizing structure to erase the past and create a nice new future that's a Syrian future or an Iraqi future, rather than the Maronites or Druze or Kurds or Sunni Arabs feeling they can continue their culture. Therein lies the problem. Now, the article I wrote essentially is that with the destruction of again, Assad kept his country together through.
This is Bashar al-Assad, who was a dictator. He was an Alawite, which is a minority. He took over dynastically from his father, who I think understood as an Alawite, I either rule or I get beat they beat the hell out of me.
That's right. And rule meant slaughter myself into safety.
Right.
And that's so Syria was a repressive state of the highest order, with incredible brutality, so much so that it couldn't rely anymore on its own structures to survive, and it needed the Iranians in the form of the IRGC and the Russians giving air power, and Hezbollah on the ground, boots on the ground for Iran to maintain the security structure of Syria. The problem was that the Israelis obliterated that. During the problem, it's a good thing. They obliterated that security structure of the IRGC and the Hezbollah structure upon which the regime rested and which was committing in the recent decade or two most of the massacres against Syrians, those were destroyed, which left a vacuum. So HTS, this Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, this Muslim Brotherhood Islamist faction that emerged from Al-Qaeda, Iraq, that this guy Ahmed al-Julani, or really Muhammad al-Shara is his real name. Julani means from the Golan.
Right.
Took over Syria with tremendous Turkish direct support and indirect support. He took over Syria in this vacuum. They didn't really win. They literally just filled a vacuum that Israel had left. So in that way, I'd say right out that HTS, this faction that took over Syria, owes its success to Israel, not to anybody else.
I don't know if they're grateful, but yeah.
No, I don't believe they are grateful. But nonetheless, Turkey, of course, has seized this because Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, has had long-term neo-colonial aspirations. They're not even quiet about it. They've even called it neo-Ottomanism, and they've operated that way in the Mediterranean Sea, claiming territorial waters all the way down to Libya and all over the East Mediterranean and all the resources. They've started claiming Greek islands, threatening Greece, and so forth. So they've been very, very aggressive in their neo-colonial aspirations. And Erdogan imagines also, as a Muslim Brotherhood thinker, that the dissolution of the caliphate by Turkey, Ottoman Turkey, in 1922, I believe it was, at the end of World War I, was really where the Arab world and the empire of the Ottomans declined, which isn't quite true, but that's what he does. So he is in many ways not only trying to reestablish a neo-Ottoman empire, but he is reestablishing a new caliphate.
Because the Ottoman Empire was an empire and caliphate simultaneously.
It was a sultan and caliph.
It was a sultan and a caliph, sometimes the same, sometimes not. Yeah.
Now, so he's ridden the Islamist movement in Syria to take a great leap forward in his project, in his neo-imperial project. Where the fissure is, though, in the long run, that I think is very interesting, is when you take just step back one moment. When you look at the Arab Islamist Muslim brotherhoods, especially those that are, quote, Salaf are the first generations of Islam, those that existed closest to Muhammad's actual life. Those were often the same ones as the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyad Caliphate took over after the first four caliphs. You had four short caliphs, and then roughly mid-7th century they took over, and they had a dynasty for over 100 years called the Umayyad Caliphate. It was run from Damascus, not Mecca. It faced civil wars run from Damascus against those who retreated into Mecca. For those who are interested, it was the third or fourth caliph under the Umayyads that built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and put
on top of the temple mount,
and put the anti-Christian polemics that adorn it. And nobody knows what's actually written there unless you know Arabic. Well, it's anti-Christian polemics.
Anti-Christian.
Anti-Christian. It mocks the Trinity and mocks the virgin birth quite sharply, to be honest. But at any rate, not to get too bogged down in this. The Umayyad Caliphate is what the Salafis look like as the purity of Islam. And as long as it was pure, Islam was expanding. So they see the malaise of Islam, the halting of the imperial expansion of Islam, and the decline of Islam over the last 1,000 years, attributed to the corruption of Islamic leadership after the Umayyads. So they want to return to this paradise, this nostalgic image of the early caliphs, the Umayyad caliphs. So now you take these Salafis and plant them where? In Damascus, which is the epicenter epicenter of the Umayyad Empire, of the Salafi beginning, so to speak. And you have triggered a sort of a mystical vision of where Islam is reemerging as this great volcanic force that will resume the global expansion that it had given up on because of its corruption and the corruption of its leaders over the last 1,000+ years, 1,300 years. So the imagery is very powerful, and you could see at the beginning that kind of helps Sultan Erdogan. But there's one problem he's going to have, which is you can have one caliph at a time. And if you have them sitting in Damascus, beginning to imagine and be sort of afflicted with the nostalgic dreaming of the Umayyad Caliphate, and you have Sultan Erdogan sitting in Ankara trying to reemerge, have the Neo-Ottoman Caliphate, I could imagine at a certain point there's going to be a debate over who is the true caliph.
Well,
so there are fissures there.
So, all right. So you've got Mohammed al-Jolani, also Ahmad Shah, the head of the HTS, who's made himself the head of the president of Syria. And from what I can tell, he's saying, I'm not going to book any disobedience from anybody here. He has said, whether it's true or not, I'm not going to crack down and destroy the Druze, the Christians, the various minorities that live here, but everybody bows to me. We're in control here, nobody else. Now, he is also very much seen as Erdogan's man. I don't know if he sees a jealousy there because, as you say, he's in Damascus as opposed to, but my guess is that Erdogan says to him, you're the junior partner here, not me. I'm helping you. You need me as more than I need you. I expect you to be loyal to me as we go forward. Do you see, and again, you could have wonderful relations between Shara and Erdogan for the next 5 years, and then it could break down because they don't need each other, or you could have something very, very different. Maybe I should let you just reflect on that relationship before we move on to
Sure. Well, there's two parts to it. First of all, yeah, I agree. For the moment, they're very heavily dependent, and they're also very dependent on Qatar, and they need to present a face to the West that is more moderate for the moment because they need the money, they need the release, they need room in order to consolidate their power. And they're worried about the Kurds, they're worried about the Druze, the Christians, all of whom are terrified and do not want to be part of this enterprise. So they need to eventually convince the West that, no, you need to let us force these into our control. Mm-hmm. That's first. But that means they're very dependent still on Turkey. The second thing is when Islamists fight, there's one point of unity, which is to attack either Christians or Jews. So for the moment, you could see this. It hasn't happened yet, but you could see it evolve to a point where in order to overcome perhaps this Turkish Umayyad, Neo-Umayyad Caliph Empire, Neo-Ottoman Empire split, you could see them for the moment trying to prioritize the external enemy. And that, of course, doesn't help the Israelis. It doesn't help perhaps the Saudis because they will turn their attentions on the Saudis as, quote, corrupt. And the Iranians and the Kurds and everybody else. So you could see as well their externalization of that. But that said, at the end of the day, they do share an ideological foundation. So that's key. The other thing I would caution about such a revolution is the face. We're putting a lot of stock in Jolani and his moderation. Let's just give the guy some credit. Maybe he's moderate. The history of revolutions that do not go directly to democracies, namely the American Revolution, is not a happy one, and they're never one step. They're always two-step processes. So you had the French Revolution, which you had Girondists, you had people who wanted a more moderate, non-monarchical republic that moved toward liberty. But they were part of a coalition, and they lost the power in that coalition to those who were most brutal and determined, which was Robespierre and the Great Reign of Terror that became this horror, which is the French Revolution. The ripples of which we deal with still today. Then you go to the Russian Revolution, exactly the same pattern. You had a man who all of us could like and could wish had success for, Kerensky, the Mensheviks. But again, behind the scenes, it was a coalition. You had the Bolsheviks conspiring, being brutal and determined. So the February Revolution that led to Kerensky was followed by the October Revolution that was led by the Bolsheviks. And then we then had the 70 some years of, or however many years it was, of communism. So we saw that. Then in Iran, you saw the same phenomenon again. You had Shapur Bakhtiar, who was the replacement for the Shah, and there was a grand coalition of people who were very liberal, communists, and Islamists. Islamists were, again, the most brutal and determined and conspiring. And sure enough, within a year, half a year, Khomeini took over, and we're dealing with the consequences of that. So I would look at these two-step processes are how these revolutions materialize. So even if you like Giuliani and you believe him and you think he's really great, we've got a problem that these revolutions are usually two-step in the region.
I'm also concerned with the Kurds in the northeast of the country have now, and this is among people we know and like, and this is a controversy. The Kurds up there have been working hand in glove with a small group, 1,000, I think is more than that now, of Americans, mostly elite troops, and their job has been to suppress the Islamic State, which was deprived of its territory but still exists, and to keep incarcerated, essentially in kind of camps, various captured Islamic State terrorists. The Kurds are doing all that for the U.S. Why? There's a controversy for the following reason. One is, I think we know that Erdogan is antagonistic and hostile to the Kurds, and not least to those Kurds, and would like to kill them. And I am concerned that President Trump will say, but there's no good reason for American troops to be in northeast Syria. We can leave. And Erdogan will say, yeah, there's no reason. We'll take care of everything up there. Don't worry about it. We're your friends. We're a NATO ally. We'll do it. And then he'll slaughter the Kurds. And as I say, there are people within the foreign policy community, even kind of right of center like you and me, who would say, yeah, but, those Kurds are part of a Kurdish terrorist organization or aligned with Kurdish terror. So I can't really worry about them. But I think, and this is why, James Mattis, I know that when he was defense secretary, Trump fell out with him for good reason. I think Mattis, I don't think understood that it was his job to take orders, not give orders. Nonetheless, Mattis, I don't think it was wrong to say, I cannot betray the Kurds who have fought with us. I know too many American soldiers who say the Kurds had my back. The Kurds are our allies. An America that is great does not betray its allies or leave them to be slaughtered by the Turks. You might want to follow up on some of that.
I think the Kurds are really the vector or the vortex where all the vectors come in on, like we're talking about in the Middle East. And by that, I mean, look, I see the debate in Washington. I've been on the rather pointy end of a tip of spears that are directed against me and others like you. Who are arguing endless wars. These crazies want us to get involved in another war in the region, and there's no end to this. And God knows how many American troops will continue to be killed. Well, you see, this goes back to one of the core issues. Why was Mattis wrong, or right, but wrong? He was right that if we leave, they'll get slaughtered and they've had our back and so on and so forth. The timing wasn't right. But the problem with the Kurds right now is that the only other force they can look to for support are the Iranians. And the Iranians right now are evil and still run. We forget the Israelis have wounded that Cobra.
Yeah.
That Cobra is sitting in the room with us, wounded but not dead.
Yeah.
If we turn our back on that, we will be fatally bitten.
Yeah.
So it really emphasizes how critically important it is right now to prioritize the final removal of the Iranian regime, not by U.S. troops, not by a U.S. invasion. We have now gotten to the point where the Israelis have teed up a brilliant circumstance where their continued heavy pressure on Iran, their willingness to strike Iran itself, Israel's willingness to strike Iran itself. All that is required is American pressure on Iran from the outside, sanctions and protection of other allies for the moment, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. What is necessary right now is just let the Israelis finish the job against Iran and work with the Iranian people, who are vastly and in every possible way signaling they're behind us, they're behind the Israelis, and they want to get rid of their regime. All they're looking for is moral and morale support from the West and from Israel, and maybe some material support from Israel to help them. But at the end of the day, this can be done without having to have an American boots on the ground presence in Iran or in Iraq to Iran or anything else. Once that happens, you have a constellation of forces in the region surrounding Israeli power, Saudi Arabian wealth, the UAE, and Iranian power that allows for the strategic forces to secure the Kurdish areas in the north and the Druze areas if we take the policy that they should remain independent and self-governing. There are strategic forces at work then that will help them do that. And we can, so this is all a prescription for finishing the strategic morass and endlessness of strategic investment that we've had to have in the region, in the Fertile Crescent, and actually creating a circumstance for regional forces that are aligned with the United States, provide stability and a much different environment that allows America to put its efforts and its resources and its soldiers elsewhere or home.
Right.
It's a prescription precisely for the reduction of American footprint in the region, not an increase.
Right. Because if you don't want forever wars and endless wars, then what you don't want are ceasefires that pause and let your enemies rearm and regroup and continue. You don't want indecisive endings. Defeat of your enemy. That's the way to end a war, not say, let's have a ceasefire and go talk some more. And I do worry, that the regime in Tehran thinks if we can just get Trump to the table, we're really good he thinks he's a good negotiator. So are we. We can fool him the way we fooled other American presidents one after the other. I think that's a realistic fear. I hope Trump will be advised that to be very wary of these offers for negotiation from a regime that after all was threatening to kill him and is threatening still to continue people who implemented his policies, who I think should, by the way, still have personal security details. I think that would be a good thing. Anyway, I'm going on a little bit that, but I think the main point that you're making that I want to just stress is, yes, the cobra of the regime in Tehran has been wounded. It is in the American interest and obviously the Israeli interest to put it out of its misery and help the Iranian people be free. And then that's a very different Middle East at that point.
Indeed, it is. Look, beleaguered allies don't have their strategic albatrosses. They drain our national security strength. Strong allies contribute to it and allow us to, they're force multipliers of our strategic and security power. So it is in our interest to make our allies win. And that means, or at least allow our allies to win. Nobody's asking anybody to fight for Israel. Nobody's asking anybody to fight for the Iranian people. Maybe the Saudis are asking America to fight for Saudi Arabia and UAE, but that's between them and the American people in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But Israel and the Iranian people are not asking for American forces to fight for them.
They're saying enable us to fight common enemies.
Right. So it's in our interest to let them win and let them emerge strong and powerful. And that should guide going forward our discussions on the ceasefire in Gaza. That should inform our discussions on Lebanon. That should inform our policy on Iran. What makes our allies strong reduces our need for American involvement. What weakens our allies demands endless American investment. and great on an ever escalating level. So it's about time we rethink that paradigm that has guided us for 70 years of we have to reduce Israeli power, we have to harness Israel, we have to leverage and barter assets that make Israel strong for peace or strategic stability. It's actually proven to be the inverse of the dynamics of the region. And it's time that we think out of the box, and it seems that the president is headed there.
Speaking of allies, Qatar was named by the Biden administration as a major non-NATO ally. My view on this, and you've written about Qatar's schizophrenia, that Qatar has served as a critical ally to Iran, to Turkey. They pretend to be our ally with that designation. They are pro-Muslim Brotherhood. Are the Qataris, and when we're talking Qataris, we're talking about the royalty of that small island. Most people who live there don't have citizenship. Most people who live there never will have citizenship. But you've got a ruling tribe, I guess you would say, usually wealthy because America hasn't acted as an imperialist. We accept that they own all the oil and gas resources, and so they have unbelievable amounts of money that they've used to fund Al Jazeera, which I think is a dreadful Muslim Brotherhood propaganda outfit. They have, I think, corrupted our universities. But what do they do? Are they playing both ends against the middle, hedging their bets, trying to be everybody's friends? What do you see? How do you see Qatar?
When I described them as schizophrenic, I meant between the Iranian axis of evil and the emerging Turkish imperial axis.
Okay.
As far as the West, they're just playing us. They're just playing us. They don't have any ideas of affinity for the West. And I think that we really have to now engage in a thorough reexamination of our relationships with Qatar. Wherever they have appeared, wherever their money goes, anti-Semitism has resulted, anti-Americanism has resulted, warfare has resulted, instability has resulted. They have been a force for destabilization and really dangerous trends in the world. Look at who's funding our universities, and then you wonder why there's this explosion of anti-Semitism. Look who's behind Al Jazeera and what has been the medium that has been most involved in encouraging and fomenting anti-Semitic attitudes across the world. Look at the organizations they fund, Hamas and so forth. These have been the tip of the spears of the anti-Semitic genocidal efforts to destroy the Jewish state and the Jewish people, not just the Jewish state. Qatar is at the epicenter of all of these. And they are not an ally. They are a client, but they see us as their client. Mm. So we really need to re-examine this and drill down on the really pernicious influences that Qatar has had in the United States and in Europe and overall. They have been at the center of so much of what's gone wrong in the region in the last 10, 20 years. And with the decline of Iran and potential destruction of the Iranian regime and liberation of its people, Qatar will become pretty much just wholly aligned with Turkey. And it will continue its nefarious activities to ensure that even that does not go right. And so we really need to address this issue.
Is there a possibility with the rise of Imperial Turkey that even after, again, hopefully, inshallah, that the Iranian regime is no longer succeeding in its goal of becoming the hegemon of the Middle East, of doing what it has long intended to do since 1979, death to Israel and death to America on the longer scale? That Turkey, I mean, can you imagine Turkey invading or fighting a war against Israel? I guess is the question I'm asking, because Turkey has the second largest military in NATO after the U.S. If Turkey is if Syria becomes a Turkish colony, Turkey's on the border. How should the Israelis be looking at that?
I think it really depends on how much the Israelis take the Turkish threat seriously. If they take it seriously, I think the Turks will find that their assets to wage war on Israel are not as much as they think they are. I mean, one is I'm not sure they really understand the Arab world as well as they believe they do. And we see this a little bit with what I was saying about the Elamite threat. But also they've really antagonized Russia. They have an enemy ultimately in Iran. Israel is a powerful country. Greece is on their other side, and NATO is increasing, well, not NATO because they're part of it, but Europe is increasingly suspicious of Turkey. They've picked a lot of fights with a lot of people. And I think their strategic position is a bit weaker than we think. Now they're trying to consolidate it and shut down many of these fronts and threats through clever footwork and diplomacy and sort of a bit of deception and so forth. But at the end of the day, if Israel's determined to call them out and Israel's determined to cross them and establish a strong defense structure, and determined to help some those in the region that might be aligned with them. For example, some Christians in the region, Druze, Kurds, etc. And again, once again, Iran is removed from the axis of evil by having a different structure of government there, and different group of people ruling, that more representative of the Iranian people. I think Turkey's strategic situation is such that it will never quite feel confident enough to directly attack Israel. They will constantly and increasingly wage a subversive war, some of the first signs of which we may see. There were 3 Turks killed yesterday in northern, in Samaria, the northern West Bank. And it's unclear who they were, but they were armed. And the Turks claim, yes, it's ours, but they were just construction workers. They were armed construction workers in a war zone, which is where Israel's waging war against Hamas in Jenin and Shechem, which we know as Nablus. It's unclear whether they weren't perhaps sent there by the Turkish government itself. There are some journalists like Babak Takvi who says they are. I'm not sure he's accurate that they're MIT, but I think it bears scrutiny, and I think one should look at it carefully, because if Turkey is implicated in trying to infiltrate weapons and stuff into the West Bank, that would be the first case where they're deliberately taking hostile action against Israel, other than the Marmara incident at sea, where they were clearly teeing up Israel for some sort of a confrontation.
And just reflect on the converse. There was a time when Turkey and Israel had very good relations, but Turkey at that then was Kemalist, was secular, all that. Can you imagine, maybe under Erdogan or maybe under his successor, that Israel and Turkey have again cordial relationships? From an economic point of view, it makes a lot of sense for them to have good relations. But I don't know. Do you think that's in the cards or not? Not in my lifetime.
I don't believe it's in the cards as long as Sultan Erdogan rules. I think his Muslim Brotherhood ideology is increasing and solidifying, and his family and the network that he's set up, and his clan in Turkey is increasingly confident of the power they have in their neo-imperial project. So I don't see them backing off. However, Turkey is not Erdogan. Erdogan is not Turkey. Yeah. There are many other forces at work in Turkey who really have no love or desire for a conflict with Israel. 40% of the Turks are Kurds. There's a good bit of the population that is still very European oriented.
Yeah.
And Turkey is a very weak economy. I see forces at work in Turkey that could lead this to a point of peaking and receding. And then you do have options for an Israeli-Turkish condominium and amicable relations again. But under Erdogan, I find that unlikely.
And just a few more subjects real quickly. One is, to talk about condominiums, Russia and Iran have sealed a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership signed actually by Putin and by the Iranian president, Pezeshkian. So what we're seeing there is kind of a realignment. It's a weakened Iran, and Russia also weakened because not clear whether they'll be able to keep their warm water port in Syria or not, and whether they can even afford to do so. Whether Putin thinks that's really important, and whether that may be a playing card he can use, or that can be used by Trump to say, you want to stay in Syria, here's how you do it, but here's what I need you to back off on Ukraine. I mean, there's just a lot of moving pieces here. And then you have China, and people don't realize China watches, Xi Jinping watches all this and thinks, what's my play? I need the oil. I want to be an influence. I want to displace the Americans as the global power. People should come to me and ask me to help them, and I can do so. Anyhow, just reflect on that a little bit for me.
Well, sure. Okay. 2 days before Hamas launched its war on October 7th, 2023, 2 days before that, there was a summit in Sochi called the Valdai Conference, where Putin gave a major foreign policy speech, and he outlined his strategic vision, which was that if you put Iran, India, China, Russia together, the BRICS country, which includes Brazil, which was under Silva, so it's also in his orbit, that is larger than the whole Western bloc in terms of economy, and it represents a strategic bloc that if it chooses to confront the West, it can confront the West. If pieces of the West want to abandon the West and join him, well, he's happy to have them. So he had this strategic vision that was anchored to the BRICS, to this bloc. Now, what's happened? Iran is obliterated. It's still surviving, but it's really weak. India doesn't really want to play that game. India wants to be in between everything, and they have pretty good relations with Israel, and they have good relations with Japan and others. So they don't really want to join that bloc and be a strategic threat to the West. The old non-alignment movement, Nehru, India, is gone. China is increasingly looking at Russia as a weak link and has also alternative interests. China has the Belt and Road where it's trying to go and take over all of Central Asia and attach itself to the Middle East and have allies there, and then to take the Sahel region of Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa, and create another economic zone there that's under they're playing for global sort of supply chain dominance and power. And it comes up against the Russians, who all they could offer is, well, we had this nice corridor we were thinking about between Russia and India, which is now, and requires going through Iran, which is, so Russia's really very weak compared to where it was 2 years ago when the Valdai conference happened, and the whole vision of Putin's has collapsed, let alone the fact that he's not doing so well in Ukraine. So, and then his loss of Syria really endangers his position in North Africa and the position of the Wagner forces, his mercenary forces in sub-Saharan Africa, which means China or Erdogan's Islamic Turkey has a run for it, both in North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. So he's under strategic retreat and strategic siege. And so he's trying to consolidate what he can. Iran's all he got, one of the only things he has left. So he's going to aggressively pursue whatever he can to help the Iranians resurrect themselves, rehabilitate, and again, reemerge as a great strategic threat. Yet another reason why it's imperative to get beyond the Ayatollah's regime and bring it down and move to a new Iran.
And do it soon.
And do it soon. Yeah, so that the geostrategic aspect of Russia is again further weakened.
Right. I'm saying because Russia wants to help Iran the Iranian regime build back better, and they'll do so as quickly.
Build back better and to reassert themselves regionally to challenge the threat from Turkey and from Israel and so forth. They want to reverse what Israel's done over the last year and a half. So I think Russia is in a very difficult position. They're never to be ruled out. They too are more than a cobra. They're a whole collection of cobras, and many of them are wounded, but still, it's a very potent force. And they see threats with Turkey and others as well. So it's a very complex geostrategic game, but that's really the context with which I see them having a rapprochement, and not rapprochement, a tightening of strategic relations with Iran.
One more question quickly, and then we'll close soon after that. We talked about many of these nation states not being real nation states, being artificial. Lebanon has a chance now with Hezbollah weakened to become a real nation state. I'm not sure it's going to succeed at doing that. Or do you have any hope for Lebanon at this point?
It depends on two questions. One is the Lebanese Christians themselves. Lebanon was originally created, and its legitimacy was anchored on being essentially a Christian enclave. Right. Otherwise, it really isn't anything different than Syria. And that, of course, has been the Arab nationalist and Islamist argument. So if it reemerges, so then the question becomes, well, the Christians of Lebanon, where are they? And Maronites and others are definitely beginning to think that alliance with the West and Israel are their only path to survival, and are moving in that direction. Christian Maronites in Israel are trying to help greatly in that effort. Greek Orthodox, the Maronites have nowhere to go. If it's not Lebanon, they're gone. The Greek Orthodox still are part of the overall Orthodox world in Greece. So they always have tried to appease Arab nationalism and have tried to be more Arab nationalists than Arab nationalism in order to sort of keep their head down and secure their safety. But with what's happening in Syria, many Greek Orthodox are beginning to realize it's not going to work anymore. The line that the Islamists use after the Saturday people, they'll come after the Sunday people. More and more Christians in Syria and in Lebanon understand that from the Greek Orthodox side. So what you're seeing is a sort of a coming together of Greek Orthodox and Maronites beginning to understand they got to stick together, or they hang together or hang separately, number one. And number two, that Israel's not their problem or their enemy, but may actually provide a strategic umbrella of some sort. But then the second big thing is that the West realizes that and helps them. I'm again, not boots on the ground, not much more than moral support, really, but an understanding that Christianity is at the cusp of extinction in the region. Yeah. The Christian communities of the region are precipitously declining in Egypt and everywhere except in Israel. That's the only place they're thriving and growing. And that, again, speaks to where the Israelis are and how they treat their Christians, and how scurrilous, really, and anti-Semitic the libel is that the Israelis are killing Christians deliberately. That's now been presented out there. I mean, that's really an ugly resurrection of a 2,000-year-old libel that's claimed millions of Jewish lives. Israel is the only place Christians are thriving, and they may be the only umbrella of protection regional Christians have to survive. So it really depends on the West understanding that and at least providing moral support for Christians in Lebanon to resurrect their ability to defend themselves. But it really begins and ends first and foremost with the Christians of Lebanon. Do they understand that the game of balancing out all these factions is over? Hezbollah has to be removed, and it can't be balanced against others. The Sunni Islamist movement, the rising in the north and trying to align with Syria, has to be, that equilibrium that defined Lebanon is over. It cannot work anymore. It has to reemerge as a Christian Druze alliance, specifically more a Christian country. And with a major Druze component. This goes back to 1711. But at any rate, a major Druze component. That has to survive now and be cultivated as the future Lebanon. And I'm not sure yet they feel that mentally they've departed from the navigate the equilibrium mindset.
Are there any other points, either in your essay or not in your essay, that I didn't manage to ask you about and that you want to get in before we close down for today?
No, but one thing I do think that we do have to come to, it's a minor point, but ever since the mid-'70s, there was a Shiite awakening that was triggered before the Iranian Revolution by Musa al-Sadr. The Iranians tried to hijack it.
Right.
And in hijacking it, I think they've done a great tragedy. They've destroyed the Shiite awakening.
Mm.
And we're not there yet because Hezbollah is still alive and Iran is still there. But it's really kind of a tragedy that you had a movement of a productive Shiite awakening that was hijacked by these radical crazies in Iran and Hezbollah. And they took control of that ship and they've literally sunk it. And I think that's a millennial disaster for the Shiites.
And just so I understand, the more moderate Shiite awakening is more what? That we explain what that could have been.
Well, they were quiescent. They woke up and began to understand their power. But the idea that that power would be wedded to governance or taking control of government, or worse, to a new neo-imperial Islamic project, which is what Iran then launched and Hezbollah launched, was never in the cards. It was a much more quiescent one under clerics like Khoi and al-Hakim in Iraq and Musa al-Sadr, same family, but different than Muqtada al-Sadr. And they were much more quiescent and more trying to seek sort of an autonomy, sort of what you're seeing with the Maronites and Druze and Kurds, try to carve out some degree of being left alone.
Right.
And so it was that. But it's hard to see where anything survives that after the Iranians defined it in a malignant way.
In a post-regime world in Tehran, you might see that come back. Possibly.
Yeah, although I think the post-regime world in Tehran is going to be focused on nostalgia toward Persia rather than resurrecting the Iranian culture, rather than trying to reinvent Shiism.
I see. Fascinating stuff. David, good to read you. Good to talk to you. Thanks for all you do. Keep on top of this stuff. And let's talk again real soon. And thanks to all of you who have been with us today for this conversation here on Foreign Policy.